Hi, everyone. Thanks for your patience. We had a little technical difficulty getting started just now, but welcome to our studio. I'm Maureen Mills, and my husband, Steve Zoldak, is the director today. So he'll be manning the computer, personing the computer, and relaying any questions that you might have about our studio, about our work, or about what I'm doing on the wheel to me, so I can answer them live too. It's it is live, but there's a bit of a delay, maybe 30 to 60 seconds even. So we'll keep up with the questions and keep everything flowing today. I'm going to be making some round styled pots on the potter's wheel today, generally styled after Korean moon jars, which are typically made from a white clay, usually porcelain. This isn't porcelain, but it is white, and they tend to be round and have a small collar and a little bit of a base. So I'm going to start on those today, making them round, adding a collar, and I think I'll even put some with texture on them. If any of you know either mine or my husband's work, you know that we're a little bit obsessed with pattern. And so one thing is not generally enough to satisfy our need for surface decoration. So we probably do a couple of things on each of the pieces. And well, you could see any of that evidence on our website at sliptrail.com. Anyway, I'm going to start. I have just a few simple tools, and I will be doing as much as I can on the potter's wheel, so I have as little finished work as possible in the end. And I'm going to start by centering the clay. If any of you have been to the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen's Fair before, this is the virtual fair, our first time. But usually Steve and I are demonstrating at the fair under a tent. We have our booth set up on one side of the tent, and then we have a little mini studio set up on the other side of the tent to do demonstrations just like this, except that instead of a camera, there'd be people sitting in front of us, and you could ask us the questions. And I really like doing that kind of demonstrating because the engaging with you really gives me an opportunity to think about what I'm doing slightly differently and articulate it differently, as well as I take that opportunity to try some things that I've never tried before. And this is not really the day for me to be trying that sort of new thing. So I'm returning to the moon jar form. Like I said, so typically those jars would be very smooth and white in porcelain and glazed with something rather transparent, maybe like a celadon glaze, which is a pale green. Mine will have different variety of surface decoration on them, and they'll likely be fired in a wood burning kiln. So we, at our studio here in Portsmouth, we have a gas kiln where most of our work is fired. We just had 2 firings last week in preparation for the virtual fair, and I'm getting ready for a firing in September in the community wood kiln that I fire in down in Massachusetts. And so hopefully these will be ready by then for me to take down there. The process of making pots is a little bit lengthy, aside from the time it takes to make the piece on the wheel, which I'd have to say is really probably the shortest time in the whole ceramic process. But once they're made on the wheel, they have to start to dry to a stage that's called leather hard. It's a little bit in between wet and dry, where the piece is firm but still a little bit flexible. And that's the stage at which a lot of finish work is done and a lot of decorating is done. So maybe I'll get to do some of that on our next demonstration on Thursday even. We'll see how that goes. And so after the decorating, the pots have to dry completely before they're fired. Usually people do a firing called a bisque firing, which hardens the pot so that they can be glazed. But if they're not finished fired yet, the clay is still absorbent at that stage. So the water from the glaze is absorbed into the pot, and that leaves a thin shell of glaze on the surface to be melted during the final firing in the wood kiln or the gas kiln. And there's a small moon jar behind me that you might be able to see on the corner of the wheel there, and that's sort of what I'm going for here. That one actually is one of the first ones I've done in the gas kiln, and it's got a glaze on one glaze, and then the same glaze poured over it again, and then a second glaze layered on top, and then a bit of oxide added on. So there are three or four techniques on there. So I'm going to use this rib tool to compress the surface of this cylinder. I've left this rather thick. I actually haven't thrown these for a couple of months, so I usually take one or two times to figure out just how thick they need to be in order to be stretched, because you can imagine if I stretch 5 pounds of clay into a nice even-walled cylinder, I might be able to get it about this tall. But in order to stretch it into a round shape, the clay wall has to be considerably thicker, because as it stretches out, that clay is being distributed in a bigger diameter, and that amount of clay has to support that shaping as well. So it's a little bit of trial and error to figure out just how thick to leave it for just how round you want that piece to be. All the while controlling the shoulder of it here so it doesn't slump, or the underneath so it doesn't sit down on the wheel as well. Sunday's demo, Steve collapsed a bowl right on the wheel for everybody to see. That was exciting. So maybe we'll be lucky enough to have that happen again. You never can tell. I've actually been throwing standing up as well on my wheel behind me. That's how I throw most of the time. But larger forms I usually try and be a little more in a seated position so I have some leverage over the height of the form. So I'm going to start with this piece, stretching this piece into a more smooth surface. I'll do some later with some texture on them. So right now I'm pushing out from the inside. As my hand moves up the interior wall, all the clay in a pot is stretched into the height of the piece before any shaping is ever done. And so usually the clay is moved from the bottom up, you pause, and you start at the bottom again and stretch taller. So when I'm doing this kind of shaping, I do sometimes go backwards down the shoulder of the pot, but I'm not moving the clay higher. I am actually just refining curves and compressing the surface a little bit. So as I stretch this cylinder out, I'm exposing a little more and more clay each time, and that clay gets a little bit sticky. So I keep the water on the cylinder as I'm going, and that keeps it moving smoothly under my fingertips as I begin shaping. So the thickest part of the piece is usually at the bottom. That's where potters usually struggle to move the clay up and into the form. From that lower section, all the way up here, it's easier, the clay wall is easier to move, but it needs that a little bit of extra clay at the base. And if you don't get that clay moved early, you're a little bit left with a pot with a heavy bottom. And for some things, that's not so bad. For a functional form, our goal is to have the wall of the pot be very evenly thrown from the bottom to the rim, so it's very balanced in the hand. A big tall pitcher that had a very thick wall at the bottom might feel really heavy in your hand, whereas the same amount of clay distributed through the wall and the shape would feel very balanced, actually, even with fluid in it. So I think you can see the bottom. I think you can see the bottom of this pot where my tool is. I'm pushing in a little bit from the outside and out from the inside to change that shape and fill in that curve. When you look up moon jars, you'll find some historical ones, but there are a lot of contemporary artists doing moon jars too, from perfectly smooth, beautiful forms to pieces that are inspired by moon jars and have all kinds of texture and glaze and activity going on the surface. And they tend to be round, like I said, with collars, but sometimes round might mean a little more wide at the middle of that curve than evenly across the shoulder. And so there are a lot of subtleties about this kind of form, which is why it's so enticing to potters to shape. It's also a really hard shape to do, to have a nice curve that's really consistent without any bumps or irregularities. And so continuing to refine and stretch slightly is what's really happening here. Oh, that looked like that was slumping down, actually. So maybe this one has to be done sooner than I thought. That's not too bad. So a little later, when this is leather hard, I'll turn this piece upside down on the wheel and just gently refine the base of it to clean it up and maybe make it slightly smaller, and that will make the form appear to be even rounder and fuller because the base will be a little bit more narrow. So with just a gentle touch, I can shape this rim. I've discovered that I like this part of the rim not too tall. And angled in very slightly. This is one of my favorite. This is called a rib. It's just a piece of stiff plastic, but it has all different kinds of corners and curves on it, and I can get just about any form I want, any kind of edge or curve I want from one side or the other of this tool. You can see it's scraping away some of the wet slip surface on the piece, so it appears slightly less shiny. That shine is the wet surface. And every little touch changes the shape, so I want to make sure I'm getting the angle I want on all of this. And leave it to me. I usually have to go back in and fuss one more time at that bottom, so fingers crossed that it doesn't collapse. I'm not sure you can see all the way under there, but that just filled in ever so slightly to help set that form a little bit. If the curve weren't very continuous, it'd be wobbling and it would tend to want to slump, where the curve wasn't even. And so that's why I spend a fair amount of time thinking about where that curve is underneath so that it sets up well and that I can get it off the wheel fairly easily. I just rather assumed I'd be able to pick these up and put them down on my board here. Sometimes when they're bigger, I have to use a torch to set the clay a little bit before I lift them, but I didn't really think about a torch, and I haven't used one in a while, so I don't actually even know where it is in the studio. I'm going to leave that spinning ever so, leave that engaged just a little bit because the wheel head would be loose if I didn't, and this will help separate it as I lift. All right, so now each of these balls, except for the last one, was about 5 pounds, and my job now is to see if I can't get the next one just a little bit bigger. And usually what happens if I'm doing, I might work on 5 or 6 of these at the same time, and I might work on 5 or 6 of these at the same time, and it'll take me several of them to get them to be fairly consistent and feel like they're stretched enough to feel nice and even. My brain often gets distracted while I'm working, and then I can't form words. So, bear with me a little bit. So I'm going to center this by working that clay up and down. I think there's a bit of a twist in it already, and I don't want that while I'm making this nice round form. Oh, I don't know what that is. So if anybody has any questions, don't forget, you can type them into the chat that's on the side of the YouTube. And these videos will be saved on our YouTube channel, Mills and Zoldak Potters, so that you can come back to it and see it again if you need or want to. If you just can't get enough of watching somebody else throw, it's kind of hypnotic to watch somebody else throwing. Steve's hypnotized in front of the computer now watching my video. I'm going to make sure the bottom on the inside has a nice finish. When I'm throwing on the potter's wheel, my wheel is going in a counterclockwise direction, and because the wheel's turning and my hand is moving, that makes a spiral, right? Whether it's coming up the side of the pot or across the bottom. My spiral spirals in, and if you look at the inside of one of Steve's pots, his spiral spirals out in the opposite direction. That just means that we finish that bottom in the opposite way from each other, which is kind of par for the course. I'm usually the one who's doing something a little bit backwards, surprisingly enough. So I'm going to keep the clay moist by dribbling a little bit of water over my fingers. My fingers are opposite each other, grabbing that ridge of clay that you could see moving up the wall. I tend to forget that I need to leave things a little bit thicker for these kind of jars. And I started moving an awful lot of clay right there. So this feels like it might be a little taller than the last one was when it started. So I'm going to work on moving some of that clay. It's thickest at the bottom. So I'm going to try to redistribute some of that clay up a little bit into this wall without making the cylinder any taller. I'm going to end my shoulder right about there. Making these kind of round forms, we're learning how to make any curve in a pot is a little bit tricky, and to maintain a neck or a collar like I'm doing means I have to visualize that right from the start. So I'm gonna visualize my curve coming out and up, but ending here at where the shoulder will be, not up here. I want to be able to use this space to shape the collar of the piece. Maybe the next one will be slightly taller. Looks like that's what I've started here. So again, I'm going to use the straight edge of my rib tool. It's a fairly stiff piece of plastic. I'm going to press against that from the inside and try and smooth that and compress the surface a little bit. So fingertips leave throwing rings on the surface. You might have seen work that has ridges sort of going around the pot, and that's actually marks left by the potter's fingers. You can see ancient pots that have evidence of the potter's hands on them. You can see contemporary pots. I'm sure there are plenty at the fair that you might have seen that have that kind of marking on them. But because I like to do a lot of surface decorating, I don't like the finger marks competing with that if I can help it. So I try and get a really well compressed surface. There's still a little bit of twist in there, so we'll keep our fingers crossed when I start stretching that doesn't go very far. All right. Well, actually, I'm going to wet that surface a little bit. I'm going to start pushing out right off the floor of that pot on the inside. If I set that bottom curve first, it'll really let me get a nice big curve going up and around this belly. So I'm pushing up and out from the inside against this rib tool, and I'm trying really hard to keep my hand coming up very straight from the side, which means I can't lean back. In fact, I have to lean pretty far forward and into this piece to keep it straight. There's an axis that this is spinning around, and if I shift that axis, that's what makes the pots twist and collapse. I'm just going to fuss over this curve for a little while. I kind of like that widest spot to be right in the middle if I can. Nobody's asking any questions, huh, Steve? If you slide that front screen over, you can see how many people are watching. Maybe we don't have any viewers. Oh, you can just. No, not on that screen. It's on the other. Go to the browser, and then you can switch back just at the bottom, like you always do. Switch. Yeah, it's not going to change this. Get the YouTube screen. I'm going to throw that collar a little bit. Notice how I was very careful not to touch the space of that collar along the way. I left it very steady and a little bit thick. Yay! This technique of making this section of the pot is called collaring, where I start from something wider and I can control that width. That's one of the, I think it's one of the trickiest things to teach to students, because you want to visualize stopping at the rim, but look at all the places that I can stop along the way. I can set a little feature in at the bottom of that collar. I can stop and pause. I can collar that in a little bit to change the shape. I'll continue to compress and shape this edge. And I can go back, and didn't end up being much taller than the last one, did it? I'm not sure how that happened, but that's okay. So I'm gonna switch edges on my tool. I really like to include features. I maybe even call them an architectural feature, like this little ridge that meets between the neck and the body, to give me a place to choose to divide up my design a little bit.
We have a question from Lisa and Michael, who are partying together.
Oh, lovely.
And the question is, sometimes the potters create pressure with a sponge, sometimes with their fingers, and sometimes with a rib. How do you choose which to do at a given moment?
That's a very good question, Lisa and Michael. They're asking about how a potter chooses to find what thing of compression works, whether it's fingers or a sponge or rib tool. Can you reach that? I use the rib tool mostly for finishing at the end to compress, for finishing, but at the end of the stretching of the clay, I will compress the surface. Nothing is going to compress the surface as cleanly and evenly as this rib tool. This shape is very flush, and I'm pressing against it the whole way, but my fingertips have all these ridges, so that I can move slowly, but they're always going to be little ridges. So this gives me the best compression for that. And a sponge tool tends to, you can, I think you're referencing perhaps using a sponge in your fingers while you're throwing, but I think a lot of potters say they do that to keep water accessible. Maybe it doesn't compress more because it's not very stiff. Your finger's actually smoother and stiffer, and then the rib tool as well. But there are lots of different kinds of rib tools. I also have this one that's yellow, but this is much more flexible. And there's yet another level that's even more flexible and soft, and that's for really sort of fine tuning and not so much for compression. So everybody finds a different tool that they like. I have a former colleague who uses a metal rib, that skinny little metal rib. It's sort of oval shaped. He uses that on all his pots and has an incredible surface quality to the finished pot. And that in turn affects the quality of the glazed surface as well. So we choose all these things for different reasons. You might ask, Maureen, why don't you use that metal rib if you like that surface quality so much? And I would say that's a very good question. Only I don't like to use it because I can't stand holding it in my hand while my hand is wet. It's super duper thin, and I just don't like holding it. You can see that this tool has a little hole in the middle, and this is my go-to tool for almost everything, because I've got all these different shapes and curves, and I get good compression. On my board over here, I have a couple other wooden shapes that I use if I'm making much taller forms than this. So that's sort of it. You try them all and you figure out what tools you like to use. Potters are notorious for buying tools. We buy tools and we buy more tools, and then I still go back to I think, oh, I'll try that one. I might like that shape. But no, I go back to the one that I like, the one that I liked originally. Oh, let's see. Let's do this. Oh, there I did it. I put my finger into the pot that I made previously. Do you think, Steve, can they see if I use the wooden stick under there?
Yes,
can they see this? I'm going to use this angled piece to clean up that base ever so slightly. And if I get that nice and neat, it'll make finishing it later just a little bit easier. So it won't be so bumpy for the tool I'll use to do that. Does this look any bigger? We'll see. All right, clean, dry hands. My surface, I already did pull the wire, but now I see a spot that I want to fix here. Looks like there's a dent in it. How could that have happened? Don't try this at home. I pulled my wire underneath to release this piece from the wheel, and then I went and did some more work on the side, and that's often not a good thing. You'll usually send your piece flying, but I'm a professional. Okay. It is taller, ever so little bit. We'll take this one. This seems like it's about the same size. We'll try that. Oh, that's right. The last piece I started slipped off the wheel while I was starting to center, and I think that's what's gave me just a little bit of something different going on the bottom, but this one is stuck well. So to center, I'm using my fingertips and my arm to pull towards me, and I'm pushing down and in with my left hand, and that makes the center of this ball of clay move so that I'm sure to have compressed this whole thing, not just the outer surface, but inside as well. And that makes for a little bit easier throwing because all that clay has moved now into the direction of the wheel. It's possible to go too fast while you're doing this, and sometimes slowing down the wheel will help you center that clay just a little bit. It's a physics thing that I wish I could explain. Yeah. So Michael and Lisa had a good question last. If anybody else has a question, you can type it in and Steve will relay it. So learning to stay steady while you're centering and opening the clay is really the main task here when you're learning how to do this. All of your muscles, your feet have to be on the ground. You want to be very, very steady and stable. And everything happens kind of slowly and deliberately. And I always talk about a slinky actually when I'm teaching this because a slinky is a big spiral, right? It it starts on one end and spirals all the way to the other end. But if you think about, oh, did you see that? I just used the sponge on the bottom. That's because there was some water in there, and so I took that opportunity to soak up that water and compress a little bit at the same time. Anyway, slinky is a big spiral. When you get to the end, it's not just a there's not just a tail of wire sticking out. That tail is wrapped in a circle a couple of times and bound. And so that's what happens. I've got a big spiral here as my hands come up and the wheel is turning, but I have to stop at that upper edge to let the cylinder sort of close the circle. And that's how pots stay nice and steady. If you're making pots and you're kind of crooked, you let go of the piece too fast, that can send it crooked. If you don't come up straight with your cylinder, that can send it crooked. Usually has to do with your body position and speed. So I had two hands nice and steady with my thumbs sort of pulling this larger piece of clay up. For small pieces, I don't need to do that, but when they're a little bit bigger, that's a nice way to move a lot of clay and keep good compression and centering along the way. Gosh, this piece feels like it's smaller than the last already. We'll see. I'm gonna make this collar. Make the collar, and maybe I'll mark it with my thumb. Maybe we'll go right about there. So I'm gonna try to get a little more cylinder up, and I'm also gonna try and make it a little narrower. So it starts narrower and comes wider and then comes back in. So I can make this a little narrower by collaring all the way from that base and following that up to the rim. Paying attention to that surface. And all right. I'm going to use the rib tool again. I feel like on the last two, I might have had more clay at the base of that cylinder that I could draw up. I'm always paying attention to the quality of the rim here. Once or twice I've bumped it with my arm, so I want to come back to it, straighten it up and compress it a little bit so I can keep a nice thickness there. I usually, it doesn't even matter what shape form I'm making. When I have a neck or a collar like this, the collar is the last part of the piece that I'm going to define. So whether I want to make it even smaller or narrower, I can collar just that neck in. Round pots have bodies made first, and then the necks are made after that body is set. So actually, when you see something with this narrow neck, the inside has already been stretched into that form up to that collar. So that's pretty much how that happens for pretty much anybody who's working. Some people use a thing called a throwing stick, which is a piece of wood that has a bit of a curved edge that you can get into a small opening and push out with it and draw it up. But I haven't worked long enough to make that useful to me. And because the curved part is a little different than a finger, I tend to leave more ridges on the work than I really want. So that's where that comes from. My chair is slipping out from behind me. There we go. All right, let's slow that wheel a little. Just a little. I was going to make a textured one of these too. The next one we'll do texture. How about that? Put all the texture I like on it. So I'm going very slowly, letting that wheel turn and rotate, lifting and pressing out at the same time. If you watch carefully, you can see where that bottom really changes when I push out. I said earlier in the hour that where it's thickest, where the clay is thickest, is at the bottom of a cylinder, and changing it into a shape. Often a potter's hands kind of move up before they can push out, and so the bottom of a form looks like this, which is a perfectly fine shape. But if you want it to look really round, you have to push right off the floor to make that curve happen. Thanks for whoever's here today. Thanks for watching too, because I know there are an awful lot of video demonstrations going on every day of the fair. It's pretty exciting to see. I've been able to peek in on one or two of them, and I think everybody's doing a really terrific job. So Steve is so bored. Oh yeah, Steve is so bored. He's thinking about our dog Cobalt. I don't know if you could see her sitting there, between my pots. She's just being such a good girl, sleeping today in the studio after our nice long beach walk. You can follow Mills and Zoldak on Instagram too, and on Facebook. I think I posted a mugshot, morning mugshots every morning. Except I forgot mine this morning. I'm gonna have to do that an afternoon mugshot. Yikes! I had the picture and everything, but she goes to the beach and we took our mug of coffee. And we had a nice walk even today, as that storm is coming in. Well, the beauty of this is that I don't think there's a lot of variety in size here, which means I do this pretty well. I've maintained pretty good size for roughly the same amount of clay. Tell you, it's not hugely critical, that these things be exactly the same size or even close. But as a practicing potter and someone trying to make a living from the work that we do, there are some systems about how you think about what you make and the sizes that they are. For instance, you have to transport them if you're going to a show. So maybe they have to fit in a particular way in a crate, and maybe that helps decide how tall a mug should be, or a pitcher even. And those are actually pretty reasonable parameters to work in, for me anyway. And when I'm wood firing, there are particular sizes that we use of bricks, 9 inches and 13 inches. And I like to think about those heights when I'm making work. That assures me that I get more work in the kiln, to tell you the truth. And that is a good thing. I'm going to press in ever so slightly, because I think you can probably see that change. And now I want to use this edge is not quite as dramatic a curve there. So you have to learn how to move your tool just the way you want it to make one of those features or I could move very slowly and have the line quality from this tool be one way, or move a little bit faster and have it be another way. So I'm actually lifting that shoulder in there. I could see the shadow on my finger from here. I don't know if you can, but I'm just lifting that shoulder ever so little bit. All right. And I'm going to go back with the stick. I'm going to use that angle to slightly, oh, look what I did. To slightly press under this form, narrow that base. If I took a 1/4 inch off of one side, that means that's a 1/2 inch diameter smaller, which I think gives this gives a circle that much more fuller sort of shape. It's all an illusion, right? Because the circle hasn't changed. The shape of the shoulder and the belly hasn't changed, but that foot has. And actually, don't do it, Maureen. Don't do it. I was going to go back and fuss over that bottom, but I'm not going to. That's what gets me in trouble. All right. The next one we're going to do is going to have some texture. I'll do the next 2 with texture on the side. A couple of years ago, I was actually not very interested in throwing pots on a potter's wheel. And so I spent about 1.5 years or so doing, I can't put that there. I'll put it down there. I spent about 1.5 years doing hand building. And in hand building, that means I made slabs on the table, and I was able to decorate them while they were flat slabs. And then, using template forms, I'd cut the slab out and roll them into a shape like a tumbler or a bowl. And then I realized that doing all that decorating before I even shaped a pot was very different than working on the wheel, where most everything is thrown like this, and then I decorate after. Did I pull the wire under that? I don't remember, so I'm going to do it again. And decorate it after. So now I realized I can actually do some decorating on the wheel using similar textures as what I was doing with the hand-built forms. Let's do a big one. I think we're nearing the end of our hour anyway. And so we'll get this big one underway. If we go over, we go
Lisa
over.
has a question.
Okay, Lisa.
All right. So Lisa and Michael have a question of why do you prefer your foot pedal on the table?
Another very good question from Lisa and Michael about why my foot pedal is on the table. And that is all about ergonomics. And usually I'm standing at this wheel, and my pedal, actually I don't know if you can see it, my pedal for that wheel is right here on the table also. When you're standing, to have my feet flat on the ground is really important for the health of your back. And it's the same when I'm sitting, that if this pedal were on the floor, I tend to like, if I am throwing that way, my foot is usually on the pedal the whole time. But to throw like this, I want my feet on the floor. It's like exercising, actually. Feet on the floor with equal pressure stabilizes your body, and so that makes my centering go that much better. So to have my foot off the pedal, I can control it from here with my fist. It took a little practice to get used to that. But once you do, it's not so bad. And actually, you can see how little I actually touch that touch that wheel. I think that this is a pretty slow speed right now for throwing. I know a lot of people throw quite a bit faster than that. So I could start with it faster and then slow it down. Usually your wheel is slowing down as you progress through the form that you're doing, especially when you're doing these big round forms. So that's kind of important to pay attention to. But for centering and starting these cylinders, I'll be able to leave it at this speed. Okay. This is going to be another really thick cylinder, maybe even slightly thicker than the last one. I always open and set that bottom, get that bottom nice and smooth so I don't have to worry about going back to it later. That also gives me a starting place for the base of my wall, so my fingers know where the bottom of the wall is, and then I'm going to make that wall nice and even coming up. And I already said I'm making this thicker, but my goal is to make it evenly thick. So I'm going to add some texture to this piece, and then we're going to stretch it out just from the inside. And you might wonder, just from the inside, Maureen? I thought you needed to have two hands to shape a pot. Except that when you're strong and steady, and you've had a lot of practice like I have, you don't have to compress the outside all the time. Some people who have lots of texture on the outside of their pieces may have thrown this way. And yeah. So let's color that slightly. So now that I've got this cylinder, it feels to me like my wheel is going faster, but I haven't even touched it, right? It's still the same speed it was a little bit ago, but the mass has shifted. So I'm going to slow that down just a little bit. All right, there's my compressed cylinder. Oh, I'll do this all the way to the neck how did I do that before? Which rim, I can't remember which direction I like the rim to go when I do this. That's okay, we'll figure it out as we go. Okay, so now what I would normally just go right in and start stretching, but I have these really cool tools that have different patterns designed on them, and I'm going to use them I'm going to put a little bit of support on the inside. Oh, these might have some brown clay on them. That's okay. So I'm going to use my hand on the inside to help support this a little bit, but really I am just very randomly adding this texture on. And I have 3 different tools. I've tried lots of different patterns, but I have a couple that I really like because of the size of the pattern that they give, and the little bit of the contrast of shape. And I discovered recently that if I press in the top edge and I get that little shadow line there, that I really like the way that looks when it gets stretched out. And I let them overlap each other sometimes. That works too, because when it gets stretched out, it's a whole different form and a whole different kind of pattern. And then there are easily 3 or 4 more techniques that I'm going to put on top of this once it sets up to that leather hard stage again. I'm going all the way up to the rim. You might have noted that. Not having that straight collar on this particular piece Um, okay, a little bit like a patchwork quilt. I've been thinking about these a lot like fabric, though, and design and sewing and quilting and kimono fabrics and all of that. So that's kind of fun. All right, so I'm going to stretch from the inside this piece with one hand. I'm using as flat a part of my fingers as I can. I'm going to come up to the middle a little higher than before. So I'm going to end this piece right at the rim if I'm lucky. So I'll go back and forth. I know it probably looks a little funny to watch while it's spinning. I'll stop this in just a second and you can see what happens to the pattern. Watch what I do here. I'm going to lift up to get that shoulder to fill in. I'm going to use my rib tool really carefully on the inside so it's not just my fingertip pressing, and that's going to help give me a little bit more even pressure to shape that piece. So look at that. So the piece started with a fairly small pattern, and as it gets stretched, it stretches and distorts that pattern. And we're gonna, I want this edge to be a little bit irregular, so I'm gonna continue to work on that just a little bit to turn it out. I like it when it goes a little irregular. I might press a little more pattern on there. And I'll keep stretching this out until it gets a little rounder and a little fuller, and then I'll work on that base to clean it up. So, any last questions? I am willing to answer them now because in a minute or so we're going to cut out so everybody can get on to their next demonstration. This video will be available on our YouTube channel, Mills and Zoldak Potters, along with Sunday's video and some others that we've been posting. And you can contact us at sliptrail.com if you have any other questions or want to schedule a studio visit. We're here working quite a lot. I think that's all for now. Thanks everybody for joining in. We'll see you next time.